Okay, good evening and thank you for attending this presentation. We've been doing a bit of research on the Reverend James Kerr and his family for a while now. We've accumulated a lot of information, but I thought the best way to present it, because there was quite a lot of detailed information, was to do a presentation. So the Reverend James was born in 1847 on a farm called Grove Hall, which we assume that's what the farm was called, but this is where it was, on the basis of the Griffith survey and things like this. And this is the map of from the Griffith survey, and this is the farm here. And you see Ballymoney is over here, and at that time Ballymoney was a relatively small, a few streets, little more than that. So this was well out in the country, this farm. By the time I was growing up in Ballymoney in the 1970s and 1980s, Ballymoney had extended out, and it was, out to about here, and the farm was just about to be engulfed. And nowadays, if you look at the map, the farm has been completely built over. But interestingly, so this is the farm in the 1980s, 1970s or so, and this little red spot here is where I grew up, the bungalow I grew up in. So, unbeknown to me, I lived a field length away from where the Reverend James and his family grew up. And this is in a place called the townland of Kerr in Ballymoney, in North Antrim. So, as far as we can get back, the Reverend James, we can find who the Reverend James's father was. And he was called Robert Kerr, and he was born about 1816 and died in 1876. As you can see his birth record here. Died of something called Bright's disease at quite a young age. And the John Kerr who was present at the death was his son. And he was married to Mary Ann Carson. He also died quite a young age in 1864, so she just got into the recording of the death records in the General Register Office of Ireland. But she was called Mary Ann Carson, and this is actually his father's signature here. Now I had to look for their wedding, because if they were married after 1845, then as Protestants, their wedding would have been recorded in the civil records. However, as we'll see, we probably can't find it. I did find a marriage of a Robert Kerr and a Mary Ann Carson, dated in January 1849. However, the church and the townlands where this pair were from are in County Tyrone, which is about 40 miles from Ballymoney, which suggests to me that it may be a different couple. Added to this, the wedding was in January 1849. And as we'll see, at least two of their children, the Reverend James included, were born before 1849, which suggests to me that it's probably not the case. Another thing we'll see is the family were quite devout and ardent Reformed Presbyterians. And the interesting thing is that the Reformed Presbyterian Church was never very strong in County Tyrone, and you can see this vividly portrayed in the people who declared themselves to be Reformed Presbyterians in the 1901 census and the 1911 census. And what you can see is a broad arc of Reformed Presbyterians going from Monaghan, around County Armagh, down Antrim, Londonderry into Donegal, but remarkably few in County Tyrone, both in the 1901 and 1911 census. Taken together, these points make it unlikely that this is the correct wedding record, and that the fact that I can't find any other wedding record suggests that they were married. Where they were married, I'm not sure, but they were probably married before 1845. So a little bit before we get on to things about the Reverend James himself. He attended the local national school, and it was probably the one in Ballymoney he attended, although we can't verify that. But he seems to have got some kind of scholarship to Royal Belfast Academical Institution, where he probably was a boarder. And this was followed by an undergraduate course at Queen's College Belfast, which was to become Queen's University, and then he went on to the Theological Hall of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of Ireland. He was licensed to preach in 1868, and he was ordained in the Greenock congregation in Scotland, just west of Glasgow, in 1869. He was actually quite a prolific author, published a lot of books, and he visited in North America, and he was instrumental in organising the first Reformed Presbyterian International Conference in the 1890s. As a result of his prolific writing and speaking, he was awarded a doctorate in divinity from Geneva College in Pennsylvania, and here we got an old image of Geneva College. And in 1871 rather, he was called to the Glasgow congregation, and he was installed in Glasgow Reformed Presbyterian Church, which is in Nicholson Street. And this is an old picture of Nicholson Street Church. The street was demolished in the 1970s or early 1980s. But this is an old image of the church. And he ministered there until his death in 1905. But we'll return to him later in the presentation. So the family were members of Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church, and this is about 3.5 miles east of Grove Hall. And interestingly, my ancestors were also members there, which begs the question, was the Reverend James related to some of my ancestors? Is he in fact related to me? As we'll see, possibly. We can't confirm that as of yet. There were no baptism records until 1898 that exist for Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church, so we can't look up those for any information about the family. However, the church was renovated in 1879, and this is a picture from Adam Lockridge's, Professor Adam Lockridge's History of Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church prior to the 1879 renovation. But anyway, at the reopening, one of the guest speakers was the most illustrious son of the congregation in that generation, the Reverend James Kerr. There was the rationale behind having this service apparently was to raise some money for the renovation project. The total amount raised was £120, which added to the subscriptions of the congregation is almost sufficient to clear off the expenses incurred. This is a report from the Northern Wing local paper of the 12th of October 1880. So one of the benefits of having a minister in a family is that he's more likely to feature in local papers than, say, your average small tenant farmer. And as we'll see, the Reverend James officiated the marriage of many of his siblings. So, despite the fact that all the siblings were born before 1864, the start of Irish civil records, we've been able to track down most, if not all of them. And in fact, he had at least 10 siblings. So, probably the oldest in the family, it was difficult to tell, is Jenny Kerr. Now, depending on whether you look at the 1901 census, the 1911 census, or the her death record, she was born in either 1837, 1852 or 1854. Because similarly, a sister of a similar age is listed, as we'll see in a wedding record, as being the second daughter. I have assumed that she was the oldest daughter. She was unmarried, and in the 1901 census, as you can see below, she was visiting her recently bereaved sister called Susan. I'll come back to her in a minute or two, in Belfast. And in the 1911 census, she was living with her brother in the farm at Grove Hall, because as we'll see, when after the father Robert died, William, one of the brothers, took over the farm. So sometime around 1913, Jenny and her brother William, he'd retired, sold the farm by that stage. They moved to 19 Salisbury Terrace in Portrush on the coast, a few miles north of Ballymoney. And this is a picture of Salisbury Terrace, the early 20th century. Robert had died, or William, her brother William, had died a few years before, but Jenny died on the 17th of January 1925, and being unmarried, she left the residue of her estate, well over £1,000, quite a considerable sum in those days, to the Reformed Presbyterian Church, to various parts of the church, the Foreign Mission Committee, the Congregation Lay Committee, and the Irish Evangelism Committee. And this is a report of the Notice of Charitable Requests from the Northern Whig, and the various ministers who were executors of her estate. Mary Ann, or Annie, varies depending on what records you look at, was born about 1846 in Kernany, and this is the daughter who's named in the her marriage notice in the local paper as the second daughter of Robert Kerr from Grove Hall, Ballymoney. And she married James McLaughlin in 1867 in Drummachoes Presbyterian Church. And this is actually near Limavady, quite a distance from Ballymoney. So how she met him, in days when people didn't travel as much, is a bit of a mystery. But she died at a relatively young age in 1898. They had 3 children, Elizabeth, William and Robert. And they farmed a place called Clogan, which is sort of midway between Limavady and Dungiven, and you can get an indication of just how far Ballymoney is when the farm where she was from would have been here. So it's quite a distance. Ballymoney to Coleraine, for those of you who aren't from that area, is about 7-8 miles. So you're probably talking 10-15 miles. You can see the roads are not a direct route. So how she met her husband, as I say, is a little bit of a mystery. But Mary's son William took over the farm, and he married Catherine Rossborough from Lisbonny near Claudy, and they had 5 children. So there probably are ancestors out there waiting to be traced, waiting to have their DNA analysed, so they can help us to tie down more information about the origin of this family. But interestingly, Lisbonny near Claudy is where my mother's side of the family is from, of my family is from. So it's interesting that the two, despite being 30 miles apart, the two are linked by this Ballymoney connection. So then we come on to the Reverend James. And as I said, he was born in 1847 in Kernany, in Ballymoney, at Grove Hall Farm, and he died in 1905. And he was married twice. He married Jenny Smith in 1871 in Airdrie. She died, unfortunately, 11 years later. And then he remarried Lillian Lawson a couple of years later in Glasgow, and she outlived him. But when he died, and we'll come on to his death in a minute or two, he left an estate of just over £2,000, which was quite a considerable sum. James had 7 children with his first wife and 3 children with his second wife, Lillian. We've only been able to trace a spouse and a family for a few of his children, but there probably are descendants out there waiting to be traced. So as with all family history, we are never completely finished. Several of James's sons emigrated that we know of. Robert Alexander was unmarried and he emigrated to Sudbury in Canada, and this is a copy of his death certificate. And interestingly, his brother William was the person given information on his death, so he probably went up to Ontario from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia to give this information. And a memorial volume, because the Reverend James was quite an illustrious character, well known in Reformed Presbyterian circles at the time. He was much in demand for speaking here, there and everywhere. He travelled regularly from Scotland back to Northern Ireland to speak at various gatherings and church meetings. He was also a lecturer in his latter years at the Free Church College in Edinburgh. And a memorial volume or biography has been published of him, and it's located, there are various copies around. I've managed to locate a copy in the University of Glasgow, and they can't loan out copies at the present time due to the COVID restrictions because the library's shut, but they were able to send me a few pages of the memorial volume, which were quite instructive when putting together this presentation. But I will get the entire volume whenever the library's open again. And then his younger brother, John. Now John was born in about 1852 and he died in 1911 back at the farm. But in between that time he owned a grocery shop in Main Street in Ballymoney. And this is a picture of Main Street in the early 20th century. Which of these shops up the street is his, I'm not sure. There's very little information available on the grocery shop, apart from a few listings and town records and things like that. But here's a notice of his obituary, named as one of Ballymoney's most respected residents. For many years carried on successfully the business of grocer and provision merchant in Main Street. And on his retirement he went to live with the residence of his brother William Kerr at Grove Hall, and he died basically of heart disease, and again at a relatively young age. He was 59. Next in the family, probably next, so it's difficult to work out exact dates of birth, was Lizzie. Lizzie was born about 1853 and she died on the 28th of July 1876 in Antioch in Syria. You think, why? How did she end up there? Well, that's because she married the Reverend James Martin. And he was a Reformed Presbyterian minister who was a missionary in of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Antioch. And she met him when he was back visiting, and she married him in Ballymoney Reformed Presbyterian Church. Why not in her home church, I don't know. But she married him in Ballymoney Reformed Presbyterian Church on the 9th of March 1875. And but the snippet below is taken from the history of Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church. Let's just say Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church. And this is by my grandmother's cousin, actually, Adam Lockridge. So, reading this from the book, interest in foreign mission work was further stimulated in the congregation when Dr. Martin, on his first furlough from Syria, married Lizzie Kerr, a young member of Kilraughts. Began to work together in Antioch, but they had a daughter who died in 1876, and then later, later that year, Lizzie died. This is after a short illness at the age of 23. So then we come on to William. William was born about 1854 and he died in 1922 in Portrush. And he is the one who took over the farm from his father, and when he sold it in 1913, he moved to Portrush with his sister Jenny. He was actually the elder in Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church. So the family was quite involved in the church, and he married Agnes Holmes of a place called Slevena. I'm not exactly sure where that is. It may be close to the Antrim Mountains, but I couldn't track it down very easily. But anyway, this marriage was in 1889, and interestingly, for two people from Ballymoney, it was in College Street South Reformed Presbyterian Church in Belfast. And Reverend James Kerr officiated, assisted at the wedding. This was the first of many of his siblings' weddings that he officiated at. Agnes died basically of TB, very common disease in those days, killed a lot of people, a few years after her marriage. They appear to have had no children, and she died at 38, very, very young. You see here a notice of her death, and she was buried in Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church burying ground. And then this phrase is, often you'll find it in death notices of this era. His friends will please accept this intimation. So after Agnes's death, William's sister Jenny lived with him until, as we said, he retired and sold the farm in 1913. William died, as we said, a bit earlier than Jenny, in 1922, and he was also buried in Kilraughts. You can see here the notice. So the funeral cortege was going to go from Portrush to Kilraughts, passing through Ballymoney at 1 o'clock. Then the next in the family was Alice Olivia Kerr, and she was born by 1855 in Carnanny in Ballymoney, where the whole family was born, and she died in 1923. And she married Isaac Bingham, a commercial traveller or a merchant from Belfast, in College Square Presbyterian Church in Belfast in 1886. And James Kerr, Reverend James, officiated at the wedding. They had 3 sons, Robert, Joseph and Stanley, and can't find out very much about these sons, with the exception that Robert was in the merchant navy during the First World War and for the early part of the 1920s. But again, they are there to be traced. And then we come on to Susan Kerr, and she was born about 1859, and she married the Reverend Robert Dunlop, and he was from Paisley. He was minister of the Reformed Presbyterian Church in Paisley, and this was in 1890, and they married in Glasgow. But interestingly, they were married by Susan's brother, the Reverend James, but they were married in the Reverend James's house, 15 Queen's Square in Regent Park, Glasgow, and this is 15 Queen's Square today. Why they weren't married in church, why they were married in the Reverend James's house, I'm not sure. Robert was 60 when they were married. He'd been married twice before. His 2 previous wives had died. As we said, he was a Reformed Presbyterian minister in Paisley in Scotland. So Robert was originally from near Coleraine and was brought up in the Reformed Presbyterian Church to the west of, or to the southwest of Coleraine, Ballylagan, RP Church. And following his death in 1900, his wife Susan and 2 daughters, one was from his first marriage, moved to Belfast, where they lived the rest of their lives. But this rather extensive obituary was written in the Paisley and Renfrewshire Gazette about him, and gives quite a lot of information about him. So Susan was left £2,500 in Robert's will, and this is quite a substantial amount in 1900, about £300,000. She died on the 1st of August 1928 in Belfast, at University, where she lived in University Street in Belfast. Her daughter, the only child of the marriage with Robert, she died in 1948. I suspect she wasn't married. She died at a nursing home in 1948, so she had no children. And then we go on to Margaret or Maggie Thompson Kerr, and the fact that she's got Thompson as a middle name suggests to me that somewhere in ancestry of this family, Thompson, or the great grandparents may have been called Thompson. Usually that's fine when you find a surname as a middle name, it usually indicates that. And Maggie was born in 1858 or so. It's difficult to tie down the exact date, but she married Thomas Adams, and he was from Ballymoney in 1892 in St Enoch's Presbyterian Church in Belfast. And again, her brother, the Reverend James, officiated at the wedding. Thomas was a widower who had 3 sons by his first marriage. He died in 1923. However, I can't trace Maggie's death, but interestingly, she was not a beneficiary of Thomas's will. This is information about it from the Prony site. So you see, Thomas Adams of 52 University Avenue, Belfast, commission agent, died in 1923. Probate granted to Christopher Redmond Adams, nearly £1,000. And Christopher Redmond Adams was Thomas's youngest son by his first marriage. Then I find record of the house and contents being sold. This is from the Belfast Telegraph, 19th of March 1924. So the house and contents were sold, and this was 3 months before the probate was granted. And this suggests to me that Maggie died shortly after Thomas. I can find no notice of it in the papers or anything like that, but I can't think of any other reason why the house would be sold, the contents of the house would be sold, unless she had died relatively soon after Thomas. And then we come on to Adelaide, rather unusual name, but it was shortened to Ada, who was born in 1863 or thereabouts, and she married Alexander Harkness in 1888 in Ballysillin Presbyterian Church, which is in North Belfast. And again, true to form, the Reverend James officiated at the wedding. They had 2 children, Alexander, who was born in 1889, and Ida, who was born a few years later. I haven't been able to trace any information about whether either of them were married or had children. Adelaide died of meningitis at a relatively young age of 50 in 1916, and she was buried at Shankill Burying Ground in Belfast. And then we come on to Caroline, or as she was known, Carrie Kerr, and she was born in 1862. And in the 1901 census, she was living with her brother, the grocer, in Main Street in Ballymoney. And they were probably living above the shop, the grocer's shop in Ballymoney. She married a Williams Kingsbury, who also was a grocer, from Belfast on the 1st of August 1905. And this was in Belfast at Fitzroy Presbyterian Church. And this is a rather grand church, photo taken, an image taken round about that time. And you'll notice that this is one of the first marriages that the Reverend James did not officiate at. He didn't die until October 1905, but what I've gleaned from his memorial volume is that he hadn't been well for quite a few months before that time, so he was probably not able to make the journey to be able to officiate at this wedding, or maybe if he did make the journey, he wasn't able to take the service. So they had no children, from what I can ascertain, and they lived at 68 Ainsworth Avenue in Belfast. William died in 1924, rather suddenly. What off, I'm not sure, but this is where they lived. Quite a small terraced house. Carrie outlived him by quite a considerable time, and she died in 1939 in Belfast. And this is the notice of what she left. Residue of her estate was left to the Irish Mission, mission to lepers of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. So, to conclude this short presentation, despite evidence that some of the family were buried in Kilraughts RP graveyard, and William was an elder in the church, the only Kerrs with headstones in the graveyard are my relatives and ancestors. They are buried there, you know, of that there's no doubt, but they obviously, for whatever reason, I mean, the family was not, I wouldn't say they were in the throes of destitution and poverty. I know the farm was quite large, so they could have had a headstone, but they may just have had a lot of people had just a wooden headstone in those days, and that would, to time, have eroded away. None of the Reverend James's siblings were married in Kilraughts RP Church. Most of his sisters were actually married in Presbyterian churches. It's interesting in itself. And even his one daughter, who was married to the Reverend Martin, they got married in Ballymoney Reformed Presbyterian Church. Why this was, we don't know. So given the proximity of Kilraughts to County Finnan, where my branch of the Kerr family comes from, my working hypothesis, I think, is that Robert Kerr's ancestors, and this is James's father, were from County Finnan. Some of the County Finnan Kerrs, my branch of the family, became members of Kilraughts Reformed Presbyterian Church, where they transferred from Armoy Presbyterian in the 1850s. And they may have been influenced to join Kilraughts RP Church by Robert Kerr, or his father, he was still alive, who may have been born in County Finnan and so knew them well. So it's a working hypothesis, I don't know, but DNA might be the way to prove this connection, but the search for a link goes on. Okay, well, thank you for attending, and I'll take any questions now.